Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Rokar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Today, I would like to start with a big congratulations to our Vice President, Professor Sheila Folliott, who just won the Paul Oscar Chrysler Lifetime Achievement Award that honors a lifetime of devotion to the highest standards of scholarship from the Renaissance Society of America. So from here to you, Sheila, congratulations. Well deserved, and we're so honored to have you. You're very supportive of particularly young scholars and emerging scholars, and so it's great to have you on board. And it's an honor to start this session and this episode of MAP Forum honoring you. And also, I am delighted to have Dr. Sam Kennerley with us today, who is a postdoc fellow at LMU in Munich, and he's connecting from Munich with us today. Dr. Kennerley, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation as well.
Of course, it's our pleasure. So the screen is all yours, and we're looking forward to your presentation tonight.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully this will work as well as it did last time. Let's do this.
Shoot.
Is that okay?
Perfect, yes.
Okay, great.
Wonderful, thank you.
Full screen mode now. That's still fine?
Yes,
okay,
perfect.
Thank you. All right, well, already said it once, but I'll say it again. So thank you to Nagar and to the rest of the MAP team for the invitation and also for hosting this initiative in general. Lots of very interesting talks that I look forward to catching up on at the end of this presentation. So what I'll talk to you about today is more or less the theme that's on the title. So how to send a letter in 16th century Italy. And to do that, I'll make particular reference to the person that you see in the commemorative stamp here. This is Marcello Cervini. So he was Pope as Pope Marcellus for about 3 weeks in 1555, and he's probably best known to many of you now as the dedicatee of Palestrina's Mass. However, in his lifetime, he was mainly prominent as a cardinal, which he was between 1539 and 1555. Where amongst other things, he was kind of the right-hand man to the Farnese family. He was also a cardinal legate at the Council of Trent, and he was also one of the first cardinal inquisitors of the revived Roman Inquisition. So Cervini was a quite significant and many-sided figure, and he has therefore attracted quite a lot of attention already from historians. Modern historiography on him begins more or less with Gottfried Buschbel, who at the start of the previous century edited a significant chunk of his correspondence for the Concilium Tridentinum series, which is the one at the top here, and which he then also used for his book, which was called Reformation and Inquisition in 16th century Italy. So Buschbel was working before World War II, and after him there was a 60-year gap or so until the next monograph started to come out from the 1980s, but after then they've come out fairly thick and fast. So we have the first kind of very modern biography, if you like, by William Houdon, which was about Cervini as an administrator, and that's more or less the same theme as the one that you can't really see to here on the top right, which was by Samuele Giombi. They were both published, so that was in Houdon's study was in the 1980s, Giombi's was in 2010, and also in 2010 we had Chiara Quaranta study of Cervini, which was mainly about him as an inquisitor. In the past 3 years or so, I can't remember precisely, we've had two further biographies, one by Paolo Sacchetti called Publishing for the Popes, and another one by Giacomo Cardinale called Il Cardinale Maraviglioso, which is about Cervini as a bibliophile and as a patron of the press. So the primary source for all of these bibliographies has been the Carta Cerviniani, a collection of Cervini's correspondence, about 3,000 letters in total that have survived, which are now at the State Archive in Florence. In 2022, I received a grant from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation to catalogue this correspondence, and this currently exists as a database, which takes this format, so obviously meant to be machine readable. And the interest of this seminar, perhaps, is that it's a complementary one to the Medici archive, because Cervini was more or less a contemporary of Cosimo I, and in future it will be on the MIA platform with images. So thanks to Alessio and to his team for having made that possible. So in the process of cataloging this correspondence, I've come across some themes that were studied by earlier scholars, such as the Inquisition and administration and so on. But I've also come across some fairly unexpected themes, at least, such as Cervini, his frequent shopping trips to Venice for luxury goods, which I was surprised by, at least, because he has a reputation of being fairly aesthetic. And also autograph collections by corrections by Paolo Manuzio to the Latin homework of Cervini's half-brother Romolo Cervini. So I won't talk about these other topics today because there's just no time. But if you do have any questions about the Cervini correspondence as a whole, then please do let me know, and I'd be happy to attempt to answer them. So as I said, the main focus today will be a different one, and that is how to send a letter in the 16th century. And Cervini's correspondence is an absolute treasure trove for the history of communication, and largely that's because he was an extremely demanding correspondent, some might even say quite pedantic, who required his contacts to inform him about the dispatch and receipt of his correspondence, and who seems to have had his secretaries do the same, as you can see in this complaint by one of his secretaries, Angelo Massarelli. So the result of Cervini's pedantry is a wealth of information about how to send a letter in 16th century Italy, and that becomes particularly valuable in light of the state of research on the question. So to date, I've not been able to find a history of the post or communication which focuses on cardinals in particular. And literature on cardinals, even the most recent stuff I found, is not interested in the history of communication. So there's a bit of a crossed wires kind of thing happening here. So, having pretty much completely finished my catalogue of Cervini's correspondence, my plan is to write a study of it from the history of communication. And I anticipate that this will have the following structure. So I'll talk about the archival history, the kind of preparation side of things, the dispatch of the letters, and how they were used by him as well, whether they informed his decisions as a cardinal or whether they were more or less ignored, as happened with Philip II, and so on and so forth. That, however, is of course far too much to do in an hour. So what instead I'll do is to focus on just one part of this probable study, which is the dispatch of letters. And asking that broader question opens out a series of smaller ones, such as how long did it take to send a letter or for it to arrive at its destination? Who delivered these letters? What kind of routes did they use? What kind of means of transport? How were they distributed and stored? And how much did it cost? So fairly practical stuff, but all quite important, as I hope I'll show. So as a point of entry into this topic, the best question to ask is probably the first, namely, how long did it take for a letter to arrive at its destination? And this is largely because it's possible to find two very, very different answers within historiography by two fairly heavy hitters in the historiographical scene. So on one hand, of course, we have the obligatory Fernand Braudel with his History of the Mediterranean in the age of Philip II. So this study, as regards communication, is now mainly famous for his adage that distance was enemy number one. But for my purpose, the more important argument is instead that the speed of communication throughout the Mediterranean remained essentially unchanged throughout the entirety of the early modern period, by which is meant more or less 1350 to about 1650. So that's one corner. In the opposite corner, we have Wolfgang Behringer, a German historian who has made this argument a few times, but in this article perhaps most succinctly. And that is the idea that there was a communications revolution in early modern Europe at exactly the time that Braudel said that nothing had changed. And to Behringer, this was a revolution that caused concepts of space and time to shrink as a result of increased speed of communication. And in his view, this was because of the establishment of a postal system across much of Western and Central Europe, which is a topic that I'll return to later. So as noted, Braudel and Behringer are both pretty serious historians, so the fact that they disagree so profoundly requires some clarification. And luckily, there is actually enough information available to evaluate their claims. I'm not the first person to study a fairly large 16th century data set for information about early modern communications. And instead, we have a series of studies that cover the period pretty much between 1350 and 1600 without any gaps. So first of all, we have Federico Melis, whose study was mainly based on the archive of Francesco da Tini. And that is about from 1350 to about 1480. After him, we have the study by Pier Sardella, which was based mainly on the arrival of letters, as were noted in Sanudo's diaries. So that's about the late 15th century, early 16th century. After that, we have a study specifically about the Jesuits for 4 years, between 1555 and 1559 by Scaduto. We have a fairly general study of Rome in the 16th century by Jean de la Mole, which is based on Avisi that were written for the Dukes of Urbino between 1560 and 1605, more or less. And finally, a book that I just found is a postal history of the archive of Simon Ruiz, a merchant who was based at Medina del Campo in central Spain. So each of these studies has statistics about the sources that they analyzed. And if you arrange them into a kind of table and then add the Cervini's correspondence to it as well, then what you end up is something like this. So this requires probably a degree of explanation. Starting at the top, you've got the dates, obviously. You've got the number of cases, which is mainly letters, but in de la Mole's case means the number of Avisi that he read, the author, and then really to the beginning of things. So F stands for the fastest letter, S for the slowest, and then unfortunately we have different means of calculating averages. So Melis and de la Mole prefer to use averages, so just to add them all together and divide by how many there are. Whereas Sardella and others, including myself, have found that calculating the mean is better, so the number that appears most frequently. So, and this is measurement in terms of days, how long it took for a letter to get either to or from Rome from this destination that's signaled here, which are the only destinations that kind of appear across all of these case studies. So if we look at them and compare in particular Melis and the Carta Cerviniana in the middle, you can see that there's a very clear acceleration in the pace of letters. It's just a lot faster on almost every account. However, we do also see that with Sardella, who just looked at Venice, that this change, this acceleration, the pace of communication already seems to have begun before Cervini, so at the end of the 15th century. And as we'll see, this does in fact align with the creation of a postal network across much of Europe at the time. Later on, after my sample, which is in the middle, we have Scaduto and so on, and that shows that, or at least it implies, that letters continued to move even quicker as the 16th century progressed. And again, this was likely due to the post. So Scaduto's study is of Jesuits, and one of their many privileges was that they had free access to most of the postal systems in Europe, so they could send a letter with the post for free, and therefore they made as much use of it as possible. And that was also the same for de la Mole. We're dealing with fairly high kind of urgency correspondence about economics or military matters or finance and so on. So again, stuff that would be sent as quickly as possible. However, we can also see that it's not completely unidirectional. And if you look at Rome against Paris, for example, we don't see the same kind of massive change. In fact, the letters that I have from Cervini's correspondence are actually slower than what we saw in those of Melis and therefore the da Tini archive. So this kind of conclusion, or this confusion better, actually continues if we look more at the fuller range of destinations from Cervini's correspondence. Here I've only included the ones which I've considered to be statistically significant, which basically means anything where there were more than 5 letters. It's quite a small sample. There's only 632 letters which are both dated and have like a very concrete point of delivery and destination. So, as mentioned, we do see the same kind of patterns here. So on one hand, we have some letters which are extremely, or were delivered extremely quickly. So this one, for example, between Dillingen in the south of Germany and Trent in what is now the north of Italy, got there in 2 days, which would have been about 200 kilometers per day. And in this case, over the Alps and in winter. So that's quite an impressive achievement. But then on the other hand, we have some really quite baffling distinctions between slow times and fast times, and some times that are just, yeah, almost inexplicably slow. And my favorite example is Pesaro to Rome. So potentially could be 3 days to get a letter from there to Rome, or it could be 159, or more or less most things in between that as well. So in addition to very, very fast times and very, very slow times, from the Cervini correspondence, we also have a lot of, or at least some times that have a lot of mean cases. So there are some routes which have letters which are delivered within more or less the same region. So 4 days, 5 days. So in this case here of Bologna, the mean time is 4, and there's 33 instances of that within 90 cases. So it's quite high. And then on the other hand, you have some routes like Verona to Rome, where there's absolutely no mean at all. The postal delivery times or the delivery times of the mail are completely disorganized. There's no kind of connecting pattern between them. So the first kind of question that I had was how to explain these kind of statistical problems. And the first thing that I really don't think works is distance. So if you see it from this table, which I've attempted to calculate the distance between these places as well. On one hand, using a network of the Roman road map called Orbis, and on the other hand, just using Google Maps. And if anyone does that in future, actually, they're actually fairly close. So Google Maps isn't completely off if you use the cycle routes as opposed to the car ones anyway. Yeah, as you can see, there's absolutely no connection or very little connection between distance and speed of delivery. And to do that, you can contrast, for example, Regensburg with Venice. So in Cervini's correspondence, at least, to get a letter from Regensburg to Trent was much quicker than getting a letter from Venice to Trent, and much more often as well, despite the fact that they were almost 2 or 3 times further apart. Or sorry, Regensburg was 2 to 3 times further away from Trent than Venice was. So, to answer how quickly or slowly a letter was sent, we don't actually need to look at distance. Instead, I think the answer is to be found in infrastructure on one hand, and also the purpose of the letter on the other. In other words, the how and the why of communication, as opposed to the how far. So on the rare occasion that we actually go to send a letter today, we'll likely just head to the nearest branch of the post office, if they still exist. That was a bit of a contrast to the 16th century, when Cervini and his correspondents had a very, very broad range of options, at least if, like him, they were at the top of the social pyramid. So perhaps the most prestigious option was the postal system, which I've mentioned a couple of times already, and which I'll now take the occasion to clarify properly. So in the 16th century, the post meant a specific form of communications infrastructure rather than the dispatch of mail in general. And at this time, the post was a network of buildings, which were usually inns or taverns, and which were placed along roads or at towns or cities along regular intervals, usually about 30 kilometers. So at these buildings, which were called posts, you could either consign a letter or a package to be delivered by a postman, or you could rent a horse yourself, as well as a guide, and deliver the letter in person. So this means of communication is now mainly associated with the Taxis or Tasso family, who from the end of the 15th century built up a network of posts across the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, and Iberia. However, as you can see from this sketch map, and I stress this is extremely rough, this is just the networks that come across, the routes that come across most often in Cervini's correspondence. There's plenty of other ones, and there are a lot more. The lines are a lot straighter than I would like to be, but this is just for purposes of illustration. So you've got different colors, and that indicates a different postal service, as I'll explain now. So the white one in the middle of Italy is the papal courier service, which had been maintained by the popes from at least the 14th century. And in Cervini's time, they were headed by a master of the posts who had 40 or so couriers who were working under him. Right next to that, and often overlapping with it, we have the red lines of the so-called Venetian Company of Couriers, who delivered letters and parcels between Rome and Venice primarily, but also other places between the 14th and the 18th century. If we move left now, we have this quite long purple line from Lyon to Rome. And that was the so-called Ordinary of Lyon, which was a regular service provided by the Florentine merchants of Lyon and Rome to kind of connect between them. So, and then we move further left again. We have the blue lines, and what this indicates is the French royal postal system, and that would have handled most of the stuff that happened within France, obviously, but also extended as far as some important exchange networks within Spain itself, one of which was Irún in the Basque Country, but also went as far as Burgos in what is more or less central Spain. And then you have the black lines, which indicates the Taxis postal system, which mainly served the Habsburg domains. So I've only indicated a little bit of Spain because Cervini didn't write there too often, but also up into what is now Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands and Belgium. So all of these services were slightly different, and in Cervini's lifetime, the French and the papal services were technically only allowed to convey royal or curial mail, respectively, whereas the Taxis and the Venetian postal systems were actually available to private customers as well. What all these services had in common, however, is that they transferred letters or parcels in a way that was extremely uncommon prior to the 15th century. So these couriers of the post traveled faster than had been the case before, or indeed at the time, since they were, again, technically, the only users of the roads who were allowed to ride at a gallop. The physical exertion of riding at a gallop over hundreds of kilometers was such that letters were often sent in relay, where the horse and sometimes even the rider and the guide would be changed at each station along the journey to carry the letter on in that fashion. And similarly, whereas even the fastest medieval couriers appear only to have traveled during the day, postal messengers were permitted to travel at night as well. So as a result of traveling quicker and over longer periods of time, a letter sent with the post could cover distances which, at least according to the evidence that I know, were unheard of prior to the 15th century. So one of the more impressive achievements in Cervini's correspondence is a letter which was sent from Dillingen, as I mentioned, in the south of Germany, to Trent, in which the courier passed over about 560 kilometers, and again over the Alps and in winter at the time. So there's not a great deal of information about it in the letter, but we have luckily a diary which was written at the Council of Trent by Angelo Messerelli, which lets us know that it was transferred not only by the post, but by the nephew of the papal master of posts, Matteo. So this is, as I mentioned, about 280 kilometers a day for this letter to get between these two places. And that's actually not as fast as a message could technically travel. From the archive of the Spanish merchant Simon Ruiz, we have two examples where a postman was able to cover about 400 kilometers in a day. So besides providing examples of increasing speed, Cervini's correspondence also shows the growing regularity of the postal system. And such information is quite precious as there are very few tariffs or timetables that survive from the 1530s to the 1550s. So frankly, it's quite good of Cervini and his correspondence to point out what must have to them have been extremely obvious information. So on the left-hand side, you can see a reference to the so-called Ordinary of Naples, Ordinario di Fiandra. And as far as I know, this is actually the earliest example of the earliest reference to this postal system, which was the main postal route between Spanish Italy and the Habsburg Netherlands. And on the other hand, on the right, we have another letter, which was written from the Council of Trent by Giovanni del Monte, the future Julius II, Julius III, who mentions that there was a bi-weekly postal service between Bologna and Trent, between Bologna or Trent and Rome, as long as the council was being held at either of those cities. So in other words, what we see from Cervini's correspondence was that in the 16th century Italy, letters could travel quicker and more predictably than had previously been the case. And in that regard, at least, we can conclude that Berenger has the upper hand on Braudel. The speed and reliability of communication really did change during the early modern period, and the reason for that change was the formation of a large and well-maintained postal network. But at this point, I have to say, however, and to return to the table that I showed earlier, the post explains why some letters move faster than those studied by other people like Melis. But what do we do about the slower speeds that we see here as well? And as I said before, times between Rome and Spain or Rome and Paris don't really seem to have changed that much between 1350 and 1600. And so here it's important to stress that not all letters were sent through the postal system, as I just described. All of the kind of haste that was involved in maintaining postal stations, feeding horses, maintaining horses, curing horses, maintaining riders, postmen, everything was expensive, although it was not actually prohibitively so. So the archive of the Spanish merchant Simon Ruiz contains about 20,000 letters, which show the cost of postage. And from them, we see that posting a letter from Spain to Italy could cost as little as a few copper coins. In this case, it was a real, so a silver coin, just the one though. And Cervini's correspondence also contains some marks which show postage cost. I'm really sorry for the terrible images. This is from about 2018, this photograph, when I had a really terrible camera. But you can see here it says Franco. And what that means is that the post was paid for before, or the letter was paid for before it was sent. However, marks like this are extraordinarily rare in Cervini's correspondence. I think I know about 5 of them. And that's not necessarily because they weren't sent by the post. Instead, it's because at this time, letters were generally paid for by the recipient rather than the sender of a letter. And we know that cardinals like Cervini probably had access to the post for free. So in other words, if they received a letter, they wouldn't have to pay for it. And that's actually what was stipulated in the kind of guild contract of the Venetian company, where we see that couriers were obliged every time to transfer letters, a certain amount of letters, not just of the Venetian ambassador and other ambassadors, but also of cardinals who happened to be in Rome or Venice at the time. So just to recapitulate, it's likely that we have very few proof of postage costs from the Cervini's letters, due to the fact that he probably didn't actually pay for them a lot of the time, and as such, even letters that were not obviously carried to Cervini by the post may well have been carried by that medium in some cases. So again, cost doesn't really explain why the post wasn't used as much as it was by other people, such as Simon Ruiz. Instead, a greater restriction may have been geography. And to use the post, one had to be either at or near a postal station. But in the 16th century, these main postal routes bypassed even quite large settlements. Again, I apologize for the quality of the reproduction, but this is the best that I could do. So Cervini was a bishop of Gubbio, which is a fairly large town in Umbria. But it didn't actually sit on the postal road, which is the one just next to it that you can see, which goes by Scheggia, Cantiano, and so on. So the kind of white line. So if Cervini, or indeed anyone else who was in Gubbio at the time, wanted to send a letter through the post, they had to get to one of these stations in the first place. And in Gubbio, at least, this was done in a very peculiar way. On the days that the post passed by Gubbio, the bells of the cathedral would ring to gather people into town square to hand their letters to a messenger, who would then deliver them to a postal station nearby, while collecting letters for Gubbio on the return journey. This messenger would then carry the post to the town and would deliver messages for the city council first, before taking the rest to an office for distribution to citizens in front of a kind of table. So these civic couriers, or city couriers, I'm not quite sure how to refer to them really, because I've mainly encountered them in historiography about the Holy Roman Empire, about Germany. And the most famous version of these couriers are the messengers of Augsburg, again in the south of Germany, who offered a weekly service between, sorry, I've just seen that somebody's raised their hand.
It's probably by mistake.
Okay,
So,
I see.
because we do have a Q&A box, so we can write our questions in the Q&A.
I see. No problem. Just to check.
Yes. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. Right. So yes. Anyway, I'll go back a couple of sentences. So the most famous example of these kind of city-based couriers was that of the city of Augsburg, an important mercantile city in the south of Germany, and they offered a weekly service, much like the post, between their city and Venice. So while these alternative messengers are a really very frequent occurrence in historiography about the Holy Roman Empire, they're almost invisible in historiography about Italy. But the example from Cervini's experience, at least, shows that they were essential and that they did exist. Instead of these city-based messengers, a more familiar feature of the Italian landscape is a thing called a procaccio. And like the post, these were messengers who were licensed by the state and who carried letters as well as parcels along set routes and on a set timetable, including for private customers. So it wasn't just official correspondence. Where they differed from the post was instead that they didn't carry mail by day and night, instead moving either by day or by night, and often much slower than was the case of the post, usually using mules, donkeys, or by foot. So the procaccio or procacci seemed to be something of a Florentine speciality, which was perhaps a consequence of the allegedly fairly unsatisfactory state of Medici posts in the 1540s and 1550s. And the ones that we encounter in Cervini's letters are mainly the services which was sent from Florence to various places. So we've got the post now, we have civic messengers, and we have procacci who more or less did the same thing. But we also have other options as well, or at least in the 16th century, you had other options. So as in the medieval period, some companies, especially Italian banks, had their own courier services, which transmitted mail from one branch of their company to another. And besides serving their company, these messengers often carried post for private customers. And Cervini indeed used this service to carry messages between centers that were important to Italian banking, such as Rome or Lyon or northern Spain. But again, not everyone had access to these services, and even when they did, it wasn't always at the right time. Because when a courier, who was employed by a bank, a city, or even by the post, left their destination, it was normally because they had been paid for. It was on demand. And regular services did not exist for most routes. Instead, when they did, and even when they did, rather, it was only often at best twice a week between the A and the B. Services on long-distance routes were even more infrequent, and the so-called Ordinary of Flanders, that I mentioned earlier, only passed through Rome once a month in the 16th century, at least. So often, then, if you wanted to send a letter, you may have been forced to wait days or weeks before a courier was available who was going in the right direction and who you could pay. So figures of high social standing like Cervini often got around this problem by employing members of their court to act either as professional or ad hoc messengers. So amongst other things, he seems to have had his own mule service, mule trains, which did most of their business between Rome and his base in Gubbio. And that's one reference that we see to them here. But in other cases, which to me are more interesting than may not be to other people, was that letters, often even significant letters of importance or even stuff that you may have been expected to be secret, were basically handed to complete strangers who were heading in the right direction and who happened to be in the right place at the right time. These so-called, what I would call couriers of convenience, were not always slower than other options. And we know of a secretary of the Cardinal Otto von Walberg, who traveled about 500 kilometers within 3 days. But more often than not, these more informal couriers would move at a slightly more leisurely pace than the alternatives. Information about them is unfortunately quite hard to come by, even though they're extremely common in Cervini's letters at least, as they often simply pick up a message and then disappear back into history. However, I do know of one messenger who wrote an account of his travels, and this was a Cistercian called Matthias Roth, and he traveled to Rome in 1554 in order to confirm the election of the abbot of his home monastery back in the south of Germany. So like Cervini, Roth was really quite pedantic, and he wrote an account of his travels for his abbot, which detailed the dates, the stops, and even the main events of his journey. And a map of the section from Trent to Rome, at least, looks like this, with each day's journey being measured in a different color. So as you can see on the left, it took Raud almost a month to complete this journey, and he in fact explains why that was the case. So first of all, professional couriers like the post or even the procacci were usually fined if they were late, and that was obviously to encourage punctuality. And by contrast, people like Raud had plenty of spending money, and in his case, they had no fixed date at which they needed to be in Rome. So I suspect, like many other people, he was not in a rush, and he therefore allowed himself plenty of time to stop if it was raining, for example. And often he behaved as though he was on holiday. He went to Venice for 3 days, not for any particular reason, but just to see the place. And he also completed a pilgrimage to Loreto along the way. And this is all while carrying, again, fairly high priority mail to confirm his abbot. So besides the weather and his various kind of day trips, one surprising loss of time in Italy, at least, was actually due to bureaucracy. So in one case, there are many of these. Raud mentions that he was forced to wait just outside of Trent for 2 days in order to get a health pass that he needed to enter Venetian territory. And on the way back, I didn't include this quote here, but he also mentions that he couldn't get into Verona, and he in fact needed to stop before the city and make quite a long detour, again because he didn't bother to get a health pass before entering Venetian territory. He also refers on other occasions to his bags being searched, again primarily in Venice, but also in other places as well. And again, this kind of treatment, kind of slight aggression perhaps from border officials, is not something that professional messengers would have encountered. Postmen, at least, and often procacci as well, were treated as representatives of their state, and so were not normally subject to these checks, and if they were harassed or attacked, it could often be a diplomatic matter. It also seems that they were exempted from the usual health regulations that were placed on travelers as well. So they could, so I know of one example from Ferrara, I think, for example, where a procaccio was allowed to enter the city despite the fact that it was coming from a place where plague was meant to be. Okay. So I'll now come to some conclusions. At the start of this talk, I promised to discuss how one might send a letter in 16th century Italy, and I've dwelt primarily on the forms of dispatch that were available, as the choice of each option determined not only the cost, route, and as which option a person chose determined the cost, route, and speed at which a letter could be sent. So first of all, there was the postal system, the relay of horses and professional riders treading predictable routes at well-known times. And this was a combination of speed and regularity, which explains the quicker delivery times and kind of constellations of mean numbers that we see in Cervini's correspondence and indeed of other correspondence from the 16th century. On the other hand, we have messenger services like the procacci, the city messenger services, or just passing strangers. And typically these forms of communication are referred to as traditional, or even as though they were completely phased out by the postal system in the 16th century. But a bit like historians of the book realized several decades ago, that print did not immediately destroy the market for manuscripts, so too I've tried in this paper to show that even rich and privileged individuals like Cervini might prefer to use alternative forms of messengers than the post. In sum, what we have then is partly that Berenger was right. There was undoubtedly a communications revolution in the 16th century, and that was also undoubtedly a consequence of the establishment of the postal system. But at the same time, what Cervini's correspondence brings to light is the continuation of what Braudel would regard as the unchanging world of communication that carried on beneath this level of the ultra-fast postal system. So his correspondence showed that if you wanted to send a letter in 16th century Italy, you had a range of services at your disposal, which went from galloping postmen covering 400 kilometers a day to more traditional forms of communication like procacci or strangers like Raud, who would cover about 30 to 60 kilometers every day. So in other words, everyone's a little bit right. That's often an explanation or an argument that I don't find particularly satisfactory. So I look forward to hearing your comments both on that conclusion as well as any other questions or topics that you might want to raise. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I truly enjoyed also with all the numbers and how you make conclusions out of these numbers. So there is actually a question and a follow-up question, I am assuming from the same person in the Q&A. So I'm going to start with that, but I also would like to invite everyone to write their questions in the Q&A box so that I can read them to Dr. Kennerley. So the first question is that where tradespeople to carriers of letters and news?
Were tradespeople carriers of letters and news?
Mm-hmm.
The answer, yes, 100%. So, yeah, even you don't encounter it too often in Cervini's correspondence for the reasons that I mentioned, which is that he had free access to the postal system in most cases, and he also had his own court, probably about 100 people. Not all of them were appropriate couriers, but he could send various members of his household off to do their duties, and he would usually send grooms or stable boys or secretaries or even his like maestro di casa in some cases. So on the other hand, he did have connections to the Italian banking world, and we do have some examples where letters were communicated in this fashion by merchants or tradesmen, and that was usually from Rome to Lyon, as I mentioned. So this will be stuff that's highlighted in my catalog. I will like tag it with postal system, and then whether it was by a merchant or another means.
Thank you. And the second question is, who provided the horses?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the whole horse side of the postal system, in my experience, is actually quite under-researched. So I've read claims that there probably wasn't any special breeding program for postal horses, but I find that quite hard to believe because they were really covering incredible distances. And it's not like people in the 16th century didn't know anything about horse breeding. So I would expect that there were stables that were around. So each post was required to maintain between 2 and 3 horses at every time, and there would have therefore have been a kind of standing fleet available for anyone who needed them. This is in theory. And if they were not available because they'd been hired to a traveler or to a courier, then the postmaster was actually allowed to commandeer horses from the neighborhood. And he was given a kind of legal right to do that as though it were a sovereign act. So if he wanted a horse, he could go to the farmer and take it, and the farmer had no legal right to object. So in some, I'm not 100% sure. I think there probably were kind of breeding programs, but there was also this kind of commandeering side of things if necessity dictated.
Wonderful. The next question is by Elizabeth Farmer. The question is, how do you determine the speed of letters? Is it based on the recipient mentioning the date he or she received the letter in the reply to the sender?
That's a very good question. So I have 2 different means of doing it, and both of them have problems, which may be where the question comes from. So on one hand, there's the method which was mentioned here, which is you read the letter and you see what was said. But yeah, there are cases where I know for a fact that that is wrong. So that's not cast iron. But often it is right. On the other hand, I use this other thing called endorsements, which are the kind of annotations on the back of a letter. And they, again, are not 100% reliable, but they are often quite good. Most of the ones from the Cervini correspondence were either done by Cervini or his secretaries. So again, you would like to think that they knew what they were talking about. But there are some cases where the annotation has been made in a later hand. So I think that at some point there were books registering incoming and outgoing posts, which have now been lost, as far as I'm aware. And whoever this was who made these annotations had access to them and included them in some letters, but not in others. So that's the 2 main ways I've done it. And yeah, they do have problems because of the way that time was measured, in particular, not just year dates, but also when a day started in Italy was different to when the day started in Germany, for example. So I've tried to take account of that in the figures that I've made, but it's not always possible because they didn't always mention the hour.
Right, absolutely. Yes. The next question, wow, we have so many questions. So the next question is by Flavia. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I second that. I have two questions about Procacci. First, I was wondering if you could please clarify if Procacci traveled regularly between specific cities such as Rome, Florence, or Bologna, Florence, and if they were paid as private couriers. Secondly, have you ever encountered instances in which Procacci were in charge of carrying larger items, such as big boxes?
Thank you for that. So the first one was regularity and who paid for it, basically. So yeah, for the first one, for regularity, definitely. We know for a fact that I know from Cervini's letters that they certainly did move between specific towns, and definitely on a it wasn't 100% day to like the day wasn't entirely fixed, but it was more or less known to everybody that this is when it should be there. And there are some complaints when the Procaccio was late. So there was clearly a timetable, and this was obeyed, I expect, in most cases. Um, Whether they were paid, I think that they were, but it's not something that I know too much about. Again, because the annotations that I've seen from Cervini's correspondence about either portage cost or cost on arrival are quite infrequent. So I don't want to be drawn into saying yes or no to that one, but my assumption would be yes. And as regards goods transport, that is again another category that I've tried to note in my catalogue. So if you're interested in goods transportation, then hopefully you'll be able to see from there. And the example that jumps to mind isn't actually from Cervini's correspondence, but from the travel account of a English nobleman called Thomas Hobby, who traveled to Italy in the 1540s. And he traveled with a Procaccio between Rome and Naples in quite a large party. And he refers to chests that were being carried as well, if I remember correctly. But I would expect that they did have to carry these heavy items because they did use mules quite a lot, and there'd be burden more than horses. And even post officers would usually travel in a convoy of 2 or 3 horses at a time, if they were not an extraordinary courier. So my thought would be yes. But again, this might be an aside. Cervini used all manner of people to communicate goods. So he's got all things arriving on his desk at pretty much all hours of the day. And the example I like most is a Franciscan who sent him a bird while he was at the Council of Trent. So again, stuff like that, if you're interested, it should be in the catalogue.
Okay, thank you. Can you also provide some information about the catalog, if it is accessible or?
Yes, so it's not quite accessible because it's not complete, but the catalogue will be made available first, hopefully by my home institution of the LMU, and that will be a temporary kind of thing until it's all on the MIA archive, as I mentioned, I hope at the start.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. So the next question is by Gail. Has the courier in the 15th century Italy ever been studied?
Has the courier ever been studied? In the
Yes,
15th
courier.
century?
Italy.
Yes, yeah. So one problem, one theme of postal histories is that they tend to have an extraordinarily broad chronology, and they usually go from about 1350 to about 1600. So if you are interested in the post, the 15th century will always be considered, because that's, according to some people, the period in which the post really started, with the Sforza dukes in Milan. That's by Italians at least. That's thought to be the first start of it. The French say it was Louis XII, I think. So there's a kind of national historiographical divide there. But in some, yes, and the person to read there would be probably Clemente Fidele. He's written a lot of books about the post, and they tend to cover the 15th century as well as the kind of later centuries of the early modern period.
Thank you. The next question is by Rachel. Are there any major events you see as impacting Cervini's correspondence patterns?
Major in terms of wars or disasters, I guess. Or okay, I'll just assume that was the case. So yeah, there's probably one of the biggest changes is well, the papal network changes in 1539 to completely avoid Tuscany. So prior to that point, the papal services had actually gone through the Medici, sorry, through Tuscan territory, which after a certain point was owned by the Medici dukes. But with Paul III, they changed that, and instead they decided to go through the Marche. And so if you wanted to go to Bologna, you did what, if anyone can remember, Matthias Rod did. Maybe I'll go back actually in my thing. So that route here is the most common one if you want to send a letter between Rome and Bologna. So that was one big change. Other big changes are wars of religion, and basically the fact that the Holy Roman Empire is constantly at war, either with France or with Protestants. So there's a big cutoff in letters as a result of that. Just another example, correspondence between Augsburg and Rome basically stops for a few months in the summer of 1546, I think, when you have the Schmalkaldic War, and that's a bit of an issue at the Council of Trent.
Okay, so the next question is a follow-up question by Elizabeth. When you mentioned traveling by night, I immediately thought of bandits. Have you found any evidence regarding the frequency of losing mail and packages to bandits on the route?
As she, sorry, the questioner immediately thought to
You
what,
do
sorry?
actually have access to the questions, because long questions are
I see, sorry.
sometimes yes. So if you scroll down, the second question by Elizabeth Thelma.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I'm being slightly incompetent, I'm afraid. But I will just answer that as I go. So whether there was references to mail being lost. Yes, there are references to that. And it's usually from a person called Johannes Cochleus, who was sending letters from Germany to Rome. And his letters probably actually were being intercepted. So that's one fairly common form of occurrence. It happens relatively regularly. But here I would recommend that you look at a book which is being published in March 2025 by somebody called Rachel Medora, and it will deal with exactly this question. So postal espionage and the loss or capture of letters on the way. And that's out next month.
Nice. The next question is about Jews. Were Jews allowed to use the postal services? There's a little bit of context to this. Archival records suggest that Jewish communities at least sometime used their own networks, but I don't know that's because they were excluded, impeded from other means.
That's a good question, and the honest answer would be that I don't know. I would, however, be surprised if they were completely excluded, because yeah, to send, I don't know what the letters are, but if they were sent through a Jewish merchant company, for example, or connections between Jewish merchants, and that would be fairly standard practice. And Cervini at least was fairly willing. He helped set up a bank with a Jewish merchant, for example, in Lazio in the 1550s. So I would find it surprised if he also cut off other people from sending letters with him as well.
Okay, thank you. And now we get to my questions. So my first question is about how do you think the development of the postal system contributed to developing a sort of control over information or circulation of information in the 16th or early modern period in general?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, the book by Rachel Medora will help much more than I can with that, because it's about that topic. But for the period covered by Cervini's lifetime, I think that control was much less stringent. So again, we do have people like Matthias Rott who were stopped and searched by Venetian customs. But when it came to couriers or postmen, I struggle to think of somebody who was actually stopped, a messenger at least. The main avenue for interception instead was forwarding. So there were a lot of letters in the Cervini archive that he shouldn't have, and that were sent to him for him to then send on to other people. But he clearly kept them for his own use. And there are some letters which were meant for Del Monte, for example, at the Council of Trent. He was also the legate, but Cervini didn't give them to him. So yeah, the postal system is very important in surveillance because of this forwarding process and because of the customs, and also because innkeepers, again, as far as I'm aware, were meant to keep a register of which letters were sent and who they were sent to and where they were from. But that again is not exclusive to the early modern period or indeed to the postal system. In Perugia in the medieval period, letters used to be handed out on the piazza in a public kind of ceremony. So the name of the recipient and who had sent it was actually announced to everybody. And the town had to have a chat and realize that wasn't really very effective because everyone knew who was getting post from everyone else, and it was causing problems. So yeah.
Okay, so now that you were referring to Cervini's case, how did this case study challenge or deepen your understanding of the postal system in the 16th century?
Yeah, that's another good question. So it's mainly want of information, I suppose. So most of the printed sources that are usually used for history of the post, for example, itineraries, tend to exist only from the 1560s onwards. So for Cervini, you really do have to kind of work from the ground up. And the thing that has become most clear to me is how often routes changed and how insecure things were at this particular period of time. So again, I'll try to not make a mess of this, but if I go back to here, that was probably never true. It's just a summary of the period as a whole. And for example, the main route between Trent and Bologna, that existed only while the council was there, for example, and this only existed from the 1530s and blah, 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 blah. So that's one thing that I've learned from the correspondence is that postal routes change all the time. So if you do try to make maps, it's actually extremely problematic unless you're dealing with a very condensed period. The other side of things is, I guess, the importance of the material aspects of things. So I'm not somebody who was trained in material history, but it's become increasingly clear to me that that was a mistake. And you can't really understand these letters without really thinking about how they were translated in person. And besides the whole thing of cardinals not paying for the post, one reason why we have so little information about them or delivery times in Cervini's correspondence is that they were probably covered in paper, bundles of letters that were then removed, and then that piece of paper was subsequently destroyed. So things like that have pressed home the material side of things as well. So I guess it's just an exercise in humility, but that's perhaps not exclusive to the postal system.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We do only have 2 minutes. And I understand it is midnight for you in Munich. So I am curious to know about your research project as a postdoctoral fellow at LMU. Is this your project? Where does this lecture stand in your whole research project?
Where does this particular side of things stand? Okay. Again, I'll try not to mess up. So it stands there in the middle. So there is a lot more to do, and I can't answer all of these questions or many questions already. But yeah, as far as I know, as far as I can tell, this will probably be the core side of things. And the sections around it will just be for explanation leading up to this point. So one thing that I do think is important is to explain the archival history of the letters, because I've not seen too much about that. And again, the process of cataloging makes you realize how many letters have actually gone missing, primarily after Cervini's lifetime. And if you want to assemble statistics, for example, or not even just a post, but of his interests on a map or whatever, then that obviously needs to be taken into consideration. The only section I'm not too sure about is the use of the letters, and whether that's kind of extending the game a bit too far. And I'm primarily interested in that because of my professor here, Brendecker, who asked exactly that question of texts that were sent to Philip II. But they were more reports of South America, which Philip didn't have to read, whereas these are letters which were clearly sent to Cervini, and clearly he did read them in most cases. So that's about the only section where I don't know, and that might fall away. But the other 3, they have a fairly strong chance of staying.
Thank you so much. That was a very informative response, and I do appreciate that. We are running out of time, unfortunately, but it's fortunate for you because then it's already tomorrow for you. So thank you so much for staying up so late and generously sharing your research project with us. I am happy to connect you to Dr. Sam Kennerley if you have any follow-up questions. But I would like to thank you again for being with us for the last hour or so. Also thanking our audience for joining us today. As a reminder, tomorrow in Florence, Dr. Alessio Assonitis, the director of the Medici Archive Project, is giving a talk on the invention of Cosimo I de' Medici. I have provided the information in the chat, but if you have any questions, I am happy to help you. And also, please join us again next week for the first talk in March, Women's History Month. So please join us again, same time, same link. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Sam Kennerley, for being with us tonight, and hope to see you again in the future.
Yes, thank you all for your questions and for hosting.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good night. Bye-bye.